It began as any ordinary Sunday in Brentwood, the sun casting a gentle glow over manicured lawns and the quiet hum of a neighborhood that had long been home to Hollywood's elite. But inside the sprawling estate of Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle, the day would take a turn so shocking, so incomprehensible, that it would rip through headlines and social media alike, leaving a trail of disbelief in its wake. Rob Reiner, the beloved actor, director, and cultural icon, and Michelle, a quiet but beloved presence in the family's life, were found dead, brutally stabbed in their own home. The news sent shockwaves across the globe, leaving fans, colleagues, and friends grappling with a horror story they could scarcely reconcile with the image of the Reiners they had always known. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And then came the twist that no one saw coming. Their son, Nick Reiner, just 32 years old, was arrested the very same night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The shock wasn't just in the crime itself. It was in the betrayal, in the unthinkable notion that the safety of a family home, the sanctuary of parents, had been violated from within. The world struggled to make sense of the headlines. The smiling faces on magazine covers, the iconic films, the awards, the charitable appearances. How could such darkness exist behind the facade? Even more perplexing was the role of Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, who reportedly discovered the bodies and then told authorities that there was a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. It was a detail that transformed the tragedy into a complex puzzle. Who could have imagined that within a family that seemed so perfect on the surface, tensions had been simmering in silence, tensions that would erupt in the most violent and irreversible way possible? And then came the voice that no one expected to hear in this storm of whispers and speculation: Morgan Freeman. A man whose calm, measured tone has narrated countless stories of humanity, heroism, and the human condition. Freeman's words cut through the media chatter like a knife. In a rare and startling public statement, he said of Rob Reiner, he was depraved. Just 3 words, yet they carried a weight that demanded attention, reverberating through Hollywood and the world beyond. What did he mean? What had he seen or known that led him to make such a declaration? Why now, after Rob Reiner's death, when no one could respond, defend, or explain? The questions multiplied with every passing hour. As we begin to unravel this story, one thing becomes clear. This isn't just another celebrity tragedy. This is a tale of hidden lives, of family secrets that festered behind closed doors, of a world that worshipped appearances while darkness quietly crept beneath the surface. It's a story that challenges what we think we know about fame, about family, and about the people we idolize. And it begins with the very home where the unimaginable happened. A home that was supposed to be a sanctuary, now a crime scene etched into the collective memory of a stunned public. Imagine the scene. Police officers carefully moving through the Reiner estate, each room a frozen tableau of what had happened. Forensic teams, normally detached in their methodical work, could not hide the tension that hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Every photograph on the wall, every book on the shelf, every memento of a life once ordinary, now forever tainted, told a story that conflicted with the narrative the world had been fed for decades. And in the midst of it all, Nick Reiner, once a son with a presumably ordinary life, was now a suspect in a case that would dominate headlines, conversations, and imaginations for months to come. The public reaction was immediate. Social media erupted in speculation, disbelief, and outrage. Fans grappled with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the Rob Reiner they knew from films, from interviews, from decades of cultural influence, with the man described in the shadows by Freeman's words. News outlets scrambled to piece together the fragments: statements from neighbors, statements from law enforcement, timelines of the tragedy, and the cryptic tip from Romy that hinted at knowledge of a dangerous family member. It was a jigsaw puzzle, each piece more confounding than the last, and the image that emerged was far darker than anyone could have anticipated. Even in Hollywood, where stories of scandal and betrayal are all too common, this case stood out. It was not merely a tale of fame gone wrong. It was a narrative imbued with raw human emotion, fear, anger, grief, and the profound betrayal that comes when those we trust most are implicated in unspeakable acts. Every conversation, every social media post, every headline seemed to circle back to one chilling question. How could this happen? How could a family, seemingly normal, celebrated, even revered, be the stage for such horror? Morgan Freeman's statement added another layer of intrigue, a lens through which the world began to reconsider everything it thought it knew. Freeman, a man synonymous with wisdom and gravitas, had not spoken lightly. His words suggested experiences, observations, or knowledge that lent a disturbing context to the Reiner family story. And with that, the curiosity gap widened. What had Freeman witnessed? What had he known all along? And perhaps most unnervingly, what did he choose to reveal only now, after the lives of Rob and Michelle could no longer be defended or explained? As we dive deeper into this story, we will explore every facet of the Reiner family's life. The public image, the private realities, the tension-filled moments, the shocking crimes, and the unprecedented statement from Morgan Freeman. This journey will not just chronicle events. It will immerse you in the emotions, the contradictions, and the questions that have gripped audiences worldwide. It will challenge your assumptions, force you to reconsider narratives you thought you understood, and keep you questioning at every turn. Who can we trust, and what is hidden beneath the surface? By the end of this exploration, you will not only know the sequence of events, but feel the weight of the tragedy, the complexity of the family dynamics, and the reverberations of Freeman's statement across Hollywood and the world. But even as we begin, one chilling thought hangs in the air. What secrets were hidden in the lives of the Reiners? Secrets that only the most careful scrutiny, and perhaps the bravest witnesses, could bring to light? It's easy to forget, when looking at Rob Reiner on the big screen or in interviews, that he was more than just a filmmaker, actor, or Hollywood icon. To the public, he was affable, sharp, endlessly witty, a man whose laugh could fill a room, whose talent could command attention without ever feeling forced. From This Is Spinal Tap to A Few Good Men, from When Harry Met Sally to The Princess Bride, his work seemed timeless, perfect, untouchable. He wasn't just a star. He was a cultural institution. And yet, behind the cameras, behind the accolades, behind the carefully curated smiles, a very different story quietly unfolded. The contradiction is almost cinematic in itself. How could a man whose creativity seemed limitless harbor such darkness within the sanctuary of his own family? How could someone so celebrated for illuminating human stories on screen simultaneously conceal tensions, resentments, and behaviors that, as we now know, could escalate into unimaginable tragedy? The answer, if there ever truly is one, lies somewhere in the complicated intersection of fame, familial expectation, and private persona, a combination that can be intoxicating, but sometimes toxic. Growing up in the limelight isn't easy, even for someone as talented as Rob. The Reiner family had access to wealth, influence, and social status. Yes, but it came with strings. Constant scrutiny, a relentless pressure to maintain appearances, and a world eager to either celebrate or vilify anyone who faltered. In public, Rob was articulate, kind, and humorous. In private, those closest to him say he could be exacting, demanding, and occasionally volatile. Some of those traits, normally contained within professional rigor or personal discipline, had the potential to fester in ways that left family members isolated, fearful, or resentful. Michelle Reiner, often described as gentle, attentive, and quietly devoted, was the stabilizing force in the household. To outsiders, she appeared the perfect complement to Rob's larger-than-life personality. But even the most balanced relationships can be strained under wealth, fame, and the pressures of public expectation. Rumors and secondhand stories suggest that family dynamics were more complicated than they appeared. Tensions simmered behind polite smiles and holiday card photographs. And as we know now, those tensions had the power to escalate in ways that no one could predict. Nick Reiner, their son, grew up in the shadow of both fame and expectation. Being the child of celebrities is a strange paradox. You are simultaneously privileged and scrutinized, protected and exposed. Some children thrive in that environment, others crumble. Accounts from friends, acquaintances, and insiders paint a portrait of a young man struggling to reconcile his own identity with the pressures of belonging to a family both revered and exacting. By the time he was an adult, the patterns of tension within the household had become deeply ingrained, subtle at first, then more pronounced, leading to the fractures that would eventually culminate in the tragedy we now know. And then there's the public perception, the facade of perfection that Hollywood loves and cultivates. Rob Reiner, the man who directed, produced, and acted in some of the most beloved films of our time, was a figure who seemed untouchable. Yet, as Morgan Freeman's words now haunt us, there was another side. He was depraved. What does that mean in the context of a life that seemed so carefully managed, so meticulously presented? The statement cuts like a blade precisely because it contrasts so sharply with the public image. It forces us to ask, how much do we really know the people we idolize, and how easily can perception hide reality? Hollywood is a world obsessed with image. The Reiners were no exception. Awards, accolades, and appearances were a part of daily life. But the invisible pressures of maintaining that image often leave private lives vulnerable. Jealousies, unspoken resentments, unaddressed mental health issues, they all accumulate quietly, invisibly, until they erupt. In the case of the Reiners, those eruptions would prove catastrophic, manifesting in a way so violent and incomprehensible that the world would struggle to reconcile it with the smiling, talented, accomplished man they thought they knew. And yet, despite the horror, it's essential to acknowledge the complexity of Rob Reiner's legacy. He was a genius in his craft, a master storyteller whose films continue to resonate decades later. He brought laughter, insight, and empathy to millions. But genius and personal darkness can, and often do, coexist. The very intensity that fuels brilliance can also ignite tension, resentment, or, in the worst cases, destructive behaviors. It's a duality that is uncomfortable, unsettling, but critical to understanding the story that unfolds in the Reiner household. Even as fans and the public mourned, questions multiplied. How could someone so brilliant be described as depraved by Morgan Freeman? What exactly was hidden behind the curtains of a life the world admired? How did the pressures, expectations, and private dynamics shape the people within that household? The parents, the children, the extended family. Each layer we uncover only reveals deeper complexities, contradictions, and uncomfortable truths about fame, family, and the fragility of human relationships. We must also consider the role of perception itself. To the casual observer, the Reiner family appeared normal, even enviable. But perception is not truth. Often, the truth is messy, chaotic, and morally complex. For every public appearance, for every interview, for every red carpet smile, there existed a parallel reality, one filled with tension, misunderstandings, and conflicts that rarely left the home. That reality, invisible to the cameras and the public eye, would ultimately provide the backdrop for the events that shook not only a family but a nation. And then there's Romy, the youngest daughter, who by all accounts had a close relationship with her parents. Her discovery of the crime, and her subsequent tip to police about a dangerous family member, adds an eerie layer to the narrative. It suggests awareness, a forewarning, a sense that some in the household may have seen shadows before the storm. Her role, both as witness and intermediary, will become central as we peel back the layers of secrecy and betrayal that define this story. But before we move to the crime itself, before the world grasps the magnitude of what occurred, it is crucial to linger on the contradiction that defines Rob Reiner. The man loved by millions, celebrated for decades, now described as depraved by one of Hollywood's most trusted voices. That contradiction, the collision of public admiration with private reality, sets the stage for everything that follows. It is the tension, the hidden fracture, that transforms a story of tragedy into a story that grips, unsettles, and refuses to let go. And so, as we prepare to enter the estate, to reconstruct the events of that fateful day, and to hear firsthand accounts, expert opinions, and insider revelations, keep this question in mind. How do we reconcile the Rob Reiner the world adored with the Rob Reiner described in whispers and now in Freeman's startling words? How do we parse the layers of perception, fame, and private reality to understand a tragedy that seems almost impossible to comprehend. The answers lie ahead, in rooms where secrets festered, in relationships strained to breaking, and in the moments that escalated beyond control. What comes next will challenge everything you think you know about celebrity, family, and human nature. And the revelations waiting inside the Brentwood estate are only the beginning. The Brentwood estate was the kind of place that made outsiders pause. A sprawling property tucked away behind high gates and mature trees, it radiated the kind of wealth and tranquility that only a few in Hollywood ever enjoy. To a passerby, it was pristine, manicured lawns, elegant fountains, and a facade that promised order, comfort, and a life lived far above the ordinary. Yet, appearances, as we are about to see, can be deceiving. Behind these walls, a storm had been brewing, one that no security system, no privacy hedge, and no amount of money could contain. Rob Reiner and Michelle had called this estate home for decades. Inside, the house was a testament to a life steeped in art, culture, and meticulous taste. Expansive rooms were adorned with framed photographs of family and film achievements, shelves lined with books spanning literature, history, and cinema. Each corner bore the subtle marks of domestic life. A coffee mug left on a table, a toy tucked under the sofa, a newspaper spread across the breakfast nook. It was both a sanctuary and a stage, a place that showcased accomplishments while simultaneously hiding the mundane and sometimes disturbing realities of everyday family life. The first police officers on the scene described an eerie calm, broken only by the subtle signs of violence. The moment they stepped inside, the juxtaposition of order and chaos was striking. The rooms told stories of a family that had lived richly, comfortably, seemingly harmoniously. But in corners and crevices, the traces of horror were undeniable. Blood, evidence of a struggle, and the unmistakable stillness of tragedy clung to the air. Investigators later said the scene was meticulously documented, each footprint, each smear, each item out of place carefully noted, creating a timeline of fear, betrayal, and finality. Security footage and forensic analysis revealed subtle, haunting details that would only become clear in the days and weeks that followed. The cameras captured movements inside the guest house, the comings and goings of family members, and the interactions that, on first glance, seemed normal but, upon closer review, hinted at tension, avoidance, and unease. The estate was more than a home. It was a stage where the drama of life played out in private, far from the eyes of friends, fans, and the press. And yet, even behind these walls, no one could fully anticipate the violence that would erupt. The spatial layout of the estate itself played a role in the unfolding tragedy. Rob and Michelle's main residence was expansive, with multiple floors, private quarters, and spaces designed for both solitude and social gatherings. Nick, their son, lived separately in the guest house, a detail that would later become central to understanding access, opportunity, and the sequence of events. It was designed for privacy, a separate sphere that should have allowed independence. Instead, it became a locus of suspicion, a place from which the ripple of actions would extend into the heart of the family home. Neighbors described the estate as quiet, almost serene. But in hindsight, subtle signs of tension were evident. An increase in security, the occasional sighting of Nick in odd moods, and the discreet comings and goings of staff who sometimes seemed uneasy. To the world outside, these were minor quirks. To those piecing together the story, they were pieces of a puzzle that hinted at something darker beneath the surface. The estate, with all its grandeur and comfort, was a crucible, a private world where pressures and emotions accumulated in ways no visitor could perceive. It was Romy who would first breach the threshold of this hidden chaos. On that fateful morning, she entered her parents' home expecting a normal day, perhaps breakfast, casual conversation, laughter echoing through the halls. What she found instead would haunt her forever. The scene confronted her with a reality she could scarcely process. The lifeless bodies of the parents she adored, a crime committed with a brutality that defied comprehension. In that instant, the estate transformed from a sanctuary into a crime scene, from a home into a canvas of horror. Every detail mattered. The positioning of objects, the state of rooms, the subtleties of disturbance that hinted at struggle, fear, and betrayal. The discovery was more than personal, it was procedural. Romy, recognizing the gravity of the situation, contacted authorities and provided a critical piece of information: that there was a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. This tip would immediately shift the focus of investigators from the abstract to the specific, from speculation to tangible lines of inquiry. The estate, in that moment, became both the scene of tragedy and the key to unraveling the family's hidden tensions. Each room, each hallway, each door held clues, and the investigators knew that the architecture of the home itself could illuminate motives, movements, and opportunities. Forensic teams moved carefully, cataloging everything from fingerprints to DNA, from impressions on furniture to patterns in the blood. Every object, no matter how mundane, became potentially significant. A chair slightly askew, a photograph tilted on a wall, a kitchen knife missing from its usual place. Each detail was scrutinized. The meticulous work revealed not just the immediate acts of violence, but a broader picture. A family whose internal dynamics, long simmering, had reached a breaking point. The home itself was both witness and participant, silent yet expressive, telling a story of escalation that no one outside could have imagined. But the estate also reflected more than crime. It reflected character. The spaces Rob and Michelle had curated revealed aspects of their lives, their relationships, and the pressures they faced. Rooms filled with art suggested aesthetic sensibilities and care. Libraries filled with books reflected intellectual curiosity. Personal mementos revealed attachments, priorities, and family history. And yet, as the investigators moved from room to room, the contrast between these symbols of life and the signs of death became starkly apparent. The estate, once a symbol of security and comfort, was now a mirror to the tragic collapse of family bonds. Neighbors, friends, and staff who visited or worked on the property in the weeks following the tragedy reported an overwhelming sense of tension and disbelief. The estate, usually vibrant and inviting, had become a locus of grief and speculation. Security measures, once a mundane aspect of everyday life, now seemed like reminders of fragility and vulnerability. And for those piecing together the story, the spatial dynamics of the property became essential in understanding how events unfolded. Where access was gained, how tensions manifested, and where critical decisions were made. Even Hollywood insiders, used to seeing extravagance and wealth as commonplace, remarked on the dissonance between the estate's outward calm and the turmoil within. The grandeur, the attention to detail, the care and maintenance, all suggested order and control. Yet, as the tragedy unfolded, it became evident that control was largely superficial, that beneath the manicured lawns and elegant interiors, human emotions, rivalries, and secrets were simmering with catastrophic potential. As investigators continued their work, patterns emerged. The main house, the guest house, the gardens, and the surrounding property each played a role in the narrative. Movements of family members, staff, and visitors were traced meticulously. Entry points, security systems, and room arrangements all provided insights into the dynamics that had escalated into violence. The estate, more than a backdrop, was now an active participant in the story, its walls silently bearing witness to events that would forever change the lives of those connected to it. And then there is the human element, the emotions, decisions, and behaviors that made the estate a stage for tragedy. Nick Reiner's presence in the guest house, Romy's discovery of the crime, the parents' interactions, and the private tensions that had accumulated over years, all intersected within the confines of this property. The estate is no longer merely architecture. It is a narrative device, revealing both opportunity and motive, context and consequence. Every corridor, every locked door, every secluded space matters in piecing together the full story of that day. As we move from the walls and hallways into the people themselves, the estate remains a constant character, shaping events, influencing decisions, and holding secrets in its structure. Its layout, its separation of spaces, and its quiet, ordered appearance stand in stark contrast to the chaos that erupted within. It is within this contrast, between serenity and horror, beauty and violence, order and betrayal, that the story finds its emotional and psychological depth. But as the investigation unfolded, one undeniable truth became clear. The estate was more than a home. It was a crucible of hidden tensions. And as the full picture slowly emerged, investigators realized that understanding the property, its layout, and its subtle cues was essential to understanding the family, the tragedy, and the shocking truths that were about to surface. And the revelations waiting inside the estate would not only shock the public. They would challenge everything we thought we knew about the Reiners, their family, and the darkness lurking behind closed doors. The moment news broke that Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son of Rob and Michelle, had been arrested for the brutal murders of his own parents, the world collectively gasped. Headlines screamed, social media exploded, and a wave of disbelief washed over fans, friends, and the entertainment industry alike. The story was already devastating. The loss of two beloved figures in Hollywood, but the twist that their own son could be the alleged perpetrator amplified the shock into a level that few could process. How could someone so close to the victims commit an act so violent? How could a family, celebrated for its accomplishments and public image, be torn apart from the inside? Nick's life, up to that point, had seemed largely ordinary, at least in the public eye. Unlike his famous father, he had not sought the spotlight. He lived in the guest house on the Brentwood estate, maintaining a semblance of independence, perhaps trying to carve out his own identity within a family whose name carried immense weight. Friends described him as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, a man who avoided the frenzy of Hollywood publicity. Yet even in his seemingly private life, cracks had been forming, subtle, invisible, but perceptible to those who knew him best. Early reports painted a picture of a young man under pressure. The expectations placed upon him, whether self-imposed or inherited, were immense. Being the child of a Hollywood icon is a peculiar existence. Everything you do is magnified, every misstep potentially public, every relationship scrutinized. While Nick did not court fame, the family's prominence inevitably cast a long shadow over his life. Insiders hinted at tensions within the household. Arguments over finances, disagreements over lifestyle choices, and the normal but magnified strains of intergenerational conflict. The arrest itself sent shockwaves through both law enforcement and the public. Authorities described the evidence against Nick as compelling, though details were carefully withheld in the early hours to maintain the integrity of the investigation. He was taken into custody at the estate, the weight of the accusation pressing down on him as cameras swarmed. Neighbors watched in stunned silence, and social media erupted with speculation. The narrative had shifted in an instant, from the tragedy of a murdered couple to the sensational and terrifying possibility of a son turning on his own parents. Friends and acquaintances of Nick struggled to reconcile the accusation with the person they thought they knew. Some described him as troubled but never violent, others as complex and difficult, but no one had imagined the escalation to murder. It is often the case in tragedies like this that subtle warning signs exist, small, almost imperceptible hints that something is wrong, but they go unnoticed until it is too late. For Nick, those signs may have been there: mood swings, withdrawn behavior, unexplained absences, or simmering resentments. To the world outside, these were private matters, but to investigators now piecing together the events of that day, they were threads in a much larger, more troubling tapestry. The social media reaction was immediate and brutal. Fans expressed disbelief, grief, and outrage, while conspiracy theories and speculation began to proliferate. Was Nick acting alone? Was there a motive rooted in long-standing resentment, mental health struggles, or financial disputes? Could there have been other factors, pressure, manipulation, or unseen influence, that drove him to such extremes? Every angle was dissected, every tweet and post adding to a sense of chaos that mirrored the tragedy itself. Law enforcement faced a complex task. Arresting a suspect is only the beginning. Building a case requires meticulous work, corroboration of evidence, and a careful reconstruction of events. Investigators had to consider access, opportunity, and motive, while simultaneously navigating the high-profile nature of the case. The fact that Nick lived on the property complicated matters. as did the prior knowledge and warnings provided by Rob Reiner. Every decision, every action, every step had to be scrutinized not just for legal sufficiency, but for the public eye, which was watching and judging every move. Nick's alleged behavior prior to the murders became a subject of intense scrutiny. Sources indicated that there were disagreements in the family, possibly long-standing conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface. While details were scarce, investigators were particularly interested in patterns of interaction, emotional escalation, and behavioral red flags. Family dynamics are often complex, but in this case, the combination of proximity, access, and unresolved tension may have created a volatile mix. Understanding the subtleties of Nick's relationships with his parents was now central to understanding the crime itself. Even within the entertainment industry, colleagues and peers reacted with shock and disbelief. Rob Reiner was a respected figure, a storyteller whose work had touched millions, and the idea that his son could be implicated in such a horrific act seemed almost impossible to reconcile. Statements began to surface, carefully worded, cautious, yet laced with genuine sorrow. "We are devastated," said one industry insider. "Nick was always part of the family. This is unimaginable." Meanwhile, Morgan Freeman's later statement describing Rob Reiner as depraved added an additional layer of complexity. It suggested that there were unseen dimensions to the family dynamics, factors that outsiders could not easily perceive, and that may have played a role in the tragic events. Nick's arrest also prompted questions about motive, opportunity, and premeditation. Investigators examined his movements, communications, and activities leading up to the day of the murders. Did he plan this in advance, or was it an impulsive act fueled by immediate conflict? Were there warning signs that could have predicted this escalation? Each question required careful analysis, not just of evidence, but of human behavior, psychological patterns, and the subtle dynamics of a family under stress. The arrest had ripple effects beyond law enforcement. Media outlets sensationalized the story, with headlines emphasizing the shock of patricide and the inconceivable betrayal of trust. Social media became a forum for speculation, theories, and amateur investigations. Viewers and readers debated everything from Nick's mental state to family history, from financial motives to alleged personality traits. The court of public opinion was swift, unforgiving, and relentless. The story became more than a tragedy. It became a spectacle, a narrative consumed, dissected, and debated in real time by millions around the globe. And yet, for all the external focus, the internal realities of the family were more complex than anyone outside could fully grasp. Relationships within the Reiner household had layers, contradictions, and histories that were invisible to outsiders. Arguments that seemed trivial, grievances that appeared minor, and tensions that were dismissed as ordinary family conflict may have combined in ways that were explosive. The arrest of Nick Reiner, while shocking, was only one moment in a timeline that likely included years of unspoken frustration, miscommunication, and emotional strain. Psychologists and family experts later emphasized that understanding such tragedies requires more than surface-level observations. Children of high-profile parents often navigate pressures and expectations that are invisible to the public. Feelings of inadequacy, resentment, or entrapment can fester quietly, sometimes manifesting in destructive ways. In Nick's case, the combination of living on the estate, proximity to his parents, and long-standing family tensions created a situation where opportunity and emotional volatility converged with catastrophic results. As investigators pieced together the evidence, the world was left to grapple with the unthinkable. A son accused of murdering both parents, a crime committed within the heart of a household that outwardly appeared harmonious. The arrest sent shockwaves that reverberated far beyond Brentwood. The story was no longer just about a murder. It was about betrayal, psychological complexity, family dynamics, and the hidden pressures of living in the shadow of fame. It was a story that demanded attention, analysis, and reflection, both for its immediate horror and for the broader questions it raised about human behavior, trust, and the dark potential that can exist even in seemingly ordinary households. And amid the shock, questions continued to mount. What drove Nick to this alleged act? Was it premeditated or spontaneous? Were there warning signs that everyone missed? And what secrets, yet to be revealed, would ultimately provide clarity? Or perhaps deepen the mystery? The answers were still out there, waiting to be uncovered, in the very rooms, documents, and testimonies that investigators were slowly, painstakingly piecing together. But the story was far from over. The arrest, while shocking, was only the opening act of a saga filled with twists, revelations, and unimaginable truths. What happened next would shift the focus from speculation to motive, from suspicion to psychological analysis, and from tragedy to a full-blown examination of the family's hidden dynamics. And no one could have predicted the depths of the revelations that were about to surface. Romy Reiner, at just 27 years old, found herself at the center of a horror that no one could have imagined. To the outside world, she was the youngest member of a high-profile family, largely living out of the public eye, yet intricately connected to the lives and legacies of her parents, Rob and Michelle. Her role in the unfolding tragedy would prove pivotal, not just as a witness, but as a voice that raised alarms no one had heeded before the unthinkable happened. Her discovery of the crime scene and subsequent warning to authorities transformed her from a grieving daughter into a key figure in understanding the depths of this familial catastrophe. The morning she found her parents, Romy was reportedly visiting the main house, perhaps expecting the ordinary rhythms of life. Breakfast in the kitchen, a casual greeting, a shared laugh over some small domestic anecdote. Instead, she walked into a scene that would sear itself into memory. A scene of unimaginable violence. Both parents were dead, victims of brutal stab wounds. The once comforting walls of the family estate now a grim reminder of how quickly safety and normalcy can shatter. Romy's reaction was immediate and courageous. Recognizing the severity of the situation, she contacted authorities and provided information that would direct the course of the investigation. There was a dangerous family member who needed to be considered a suspect. In that single statement lay layers of insight and complexity. It suggested prior awareness, intuition, or perhaps experience with escalating tension within the household. She was not merely reporting a crime. She was signaling a history, a context, and a suspicion that few outside the family could comprehend. Her role raises profound questions about foresight and familial awareness. How long had Romy sensed that something was wrong? Were there prior incidents, conflicts, or warnings that hinted at potential violence? Reports suggest that tensions between Nick and his parents were not new. What was new was their deadly culmination. Romy's insight, provided at the earliest possible moment, positioned her as a crucial link between the private reality of the household and the public act of law enforcement. Her words guided the investigation toward avenues that might have otherwise gone unexplored, particularly the focus on Nick as a suspect. But Romy's involvement also carries emotional weight that extends beyond procedural significance. She was simultaneously navigating grief, shock, and the surreal experience of discovering her parents in such a state. The human element of her role is central. Here is a daughter, thrust into a nightmare that many of us cannot even imagine, making critical decisions under extreme emotional duress. Every word she spoke to authorities, every action she took, was informed not only by logic, but by the profound emotional turmoil of confronting both loss and suspicion. In understanding Romy's perspective, it's essential to consider the family dynamics leading up to the tragedy. Reports suggest that she was close to her parents, particularly Michelle, and had maintained a level of involvement in the household despite her age and independent life. She had witnessed the tensions, the arguments, and perhaps even moments of volatility between Nick and the parents. While no one could have predicted that these tensions would erupt into murder, Romy's awareness points to the subtle ways in which familial stress manifests and accumulates over time. Her warning also had legal implications. By explicitly identifying a family member as potentially dangerous, she provided law enforcement with both direction and context. In high-profile cases, where evidence can be complex and relationships intricate, such guidance is invaluable. It helped investigators focus on the most likely suspects while preserving the integrity of the crime scene. Romy's intuition, combined with her courage, became a cornerstone of the investigative process, bridging the gap between private knowledge and public action. At the same time, her actions underscore the tragic complexity of family loyalty and fear. Reporting a family member is not a simple act. It carries consequences, emotional strain, and the weight of moral responsibility. Romy's decision reflects not only clarity in crisis, but also a harrowing understanding that failing to act could have had devastating consequences for herself and others. The stakes were intensely personal, yet the ramifications extended far beyond her immediate family, touching law enforcement, the media, and ultimately, the public consciousness. The layers of Romy's involvement extend into psychological and social dimensions. Experts examining the case have noted that children in high-stress, high-profile households often develop acute awareness of family dynamics. They may recognize danger before adults do or notice behavioral patterns that indicate escalation. Romy's warning, therefore, can be seen not just as an isolated act, but as the culmination of long-standing observation, heightened perception, and a survival instinct honed by the pressures of living within a family marked by fame, expectations, and underlying tension. Her discovery also forced investigators to confront the reality of proximity and opportunity. The fact that Nick lived in the guest house meant he had both access and independence. Factors that complicated the narrative and required careful analysis. Romy's tip helped prioritize scrutiny of these dynamics, allowing authorities to reconstruct the sequence of events with greater precision. Her insight became a lens through which the crime was examined, highlighting the interconnectedness of spatial, emotional, and relational elements within the estate. Moreover, Romy's role adds another dimension to our understanding of trust, intuition, and moral decision-making in extreme circumstances. She acted not from malice, not from fear alone, but from a combination of grief, courage, and a commitment to preventing further harm. It is a reminder that within tragedies, there are moments of profound human agency, decisions that, while difficult, are necessary to navigate chaos and ensure accountability. Yet questions remain. How did Romy arrive at her conclusion about a dangerous family member? Was it based on specific incidents, subtle behavioral cues, or a culmination of experiences over time? Were there warning signs she had tried to act upon before the tragedy? These unanswered questions add depth to her narrative, providing both context and mystery that investigators, the media, and the public continue to explore. Her insight was crucial, but it also opens a window into the complex web of family relationships, emotional tension, and psychological nuance that characterized the Reiner household. Even as the investigation unfolded, Romy's role drew public attention, speculation, and, inevitably, scrutiny. Some questioned her motives, while others praised her courage. Social media dissected her actions, offering theories ranging from heroic foresight to alleged complicity. Yet, for those who understand the emotional weight of her position, Romy's actions reflect the unimaginable burden of a young adult navigating the intersection of grief, danger, and responsibility within a family tragedy of unprecedented magnitude. As we examine Romy's role in more detail, it becomes clear that her warning was not a mere footnote, but a pivotal element in the unfolding story. It provides insight into the pre-existing tensions, the familial awareness of potential danger, and the psychological landscape in which the events occurred. Her involvement bridges the gap between what was hidden behind closed doors and what would become public knowledge, connecting private intuition with official action. And yet, even with her courageous intervention, the tragedy could not be undone. The stage was set, the sequence of events had begun, and the consequences were irreversible. Romy's discovery, her warning, and her subsequent actions would reverberate not only through the investigation but throughout the family, the media, and the public imagination. She became a living witness to both the horror and the complexities that had led to it, a figure whose perspective would be essential in piecing together the story of what happened, why it happened, and how a seemingly ordinary family became the epicenter of an extraordinary and tragic event. But as investigators and the public focused on Romy's critical role, other details were beginning to surface, clues hidden in plain sight, behavioral patterns previously overlooked, and a web of psychological, social, and familial factors that had converged to create a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The moment the Reiners' bodies were removed from the estate, the narrative shifted from speculation to scientific inquiry. Forensic teams, medical examiners, and investigators descended on the case with a meticulousness born of experience, aware that the smallest detail could illuminate motive, opportunity, or the sequence of events. What they found would not only confirm the brutality of the act, but also provide a window into the psychological and physical dynamics of the crime. A window so stark that it shocked even seasoned professionals. Autopsy reports painted a grim picture. Both Rob and Michelle had died from multiple stab wounds, inflicted with precision and ferocity. The injuries were concentrated but varied, indicating repeated strikes, a potential struggle, and moments of both control and chaos. Medical examiners noted that the force and location of the wounds suggested not just intent, but anger, frustration, or emotional escalation. The act was deliberate yet chaotic, measured yet impulsive. An unsettling combination that suggested a perpetrator grappling with a complex internal storm. One of the most disturbing aspects of the autopsy findings was the time frame in which the murders occurred. Investigators pieced together timelines from blood spatter patterns, body positioning, and other forensic evidence. The sequence suggested that both victims had been attacked within a relatively short window, pointing to an escalation that began perhaps with confrontation and ended in unrestrained violence. It wasn't a single, isolated strike. It was a sequence of actions that built in intensity, reflecting both opportunity and an emotional crescendo. Forensic analysis also examined defensive wounds. Michelle's injuries indicated attempts to shield herself, while Rob's suggested moments of resistance or confrontation. These findings painted a harrowing picture of the final moments, a struggle between parent and child, between victim and perpetrator, unfolding in the private spaces of a home that had, until that day, been considered a sanctuary. It's difficult to overstate the emotional weight carried by these details. They revealed not only the physicality of the crime, but also the human desperation, fear, and confrontation that led to its tragic conclusion. DNA and fingerprint analysis quickly narrowed the circle of potential suspects, aligning with Romy's initial warning about a dangerous family member. Investigators cross-referenced every trace of biological evidence, every print on surfaces and objects, to determine access, presence, and interaction. The results were sobering. The patterns of evidence were consistent with someone who had intimate knowledge of the home, the routines of the family, and the placement of objects and pathways. The forensic findings were not merely confirmatory. They were directional, guiding investigators toward the suspect in ways that eyewitness accounts or intuition alone could not. Blood spatter analysis provided further insight. The distribution, trajectory, and volume indicated points of origin, angles of attack, and even the potential positions of both victims and the perpetrator. These details allowed reconstruction experts to model the events, generating scenarios that matched witness accounts, timelines, and the physical evidence on the scene. The precision of this work illuminated a level of premeditation, or at the very least, opportunity, by someone intimately familiar with the property and its occupants. Investigators also noted anomalies in the arrangement of objects within the estate. Furniture slightly displaced, doors ajar, personal items scattered, all suggested not just the act itself but the dynamics of the struggle. Some items appeared deliberately used as barriers or defensive aids. Others seemed incidental, part of the natural chaos of a sudden, violent event. Each observation was painstakingly documented, creating a multidimensional map of movement, confrontation, and emotional intensity. Experts who later reviewed the evidence commented on the unique combination of brutality and familiarity evident in the crime. It was not random. It was not the act of a stranger. The wounds, the positions, the pattern of violence suggested someone who knew the victims intimately, someone who understood their behaviors and routines, and someone whose emotional connection fueled the severity of the attack. It was a forensic confirmation of betrayal, violence born not just of physical intent, but of relational intensity. Psychologists consulted in the aftermath noted that such crimes often reflect deep-seated conflict and emotional turbulence. Familial homicides, particularly those involving adult children, are statistically rare, yet profoundly telling. They suggest a mixture of perceived grievance, emotional dysregulation, and sometimes long-standing resentment. In this case, the combination of physical evidence and relational context hinted at a convergence of opportunity, psychological strain, and unresolved familial tension. A perfect storm culminating in tragedy. Investigators also focused on the murder weapon. Knives recovered from the kitchen and surrounding areas were analyzed for fingerprints, blood residue, and positioning. The findings suggested a deliberate choice and a familiarity with the tools available in the household. It also aligned with the forensic pattern of wounds, indicating that the weapon was wielded with both knowledge and intent. The weapon, in essence, became an extension of the crime itself, a tangible link between the physical act and the relational dynamics that fueled it. Additional forensic techniques, such as fiber analysis, trace element identification, and environmental sampling, revealed subtle details that expanded the understanding of the crime. Clothing fibers, small residues, and environmental markers helped investigators reconstruct movement, corroborate timelines, and confirm interactions between the victims and the suspect. Even seemingly minor details, a smear on a countertop, a disturbed curtain, became essential puzzle pieces, contributing to a larger picture of the events that had transpired. Autopsy and forensic findings also intersected with witness accounts. Romy's discovery, her warning, and her observations provided context that was now scientifically corroborated. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the wounds, and the patterns of struggle aligned with her account, lending both credibility and urgency to her statements. For investigators, this intersection of physical evidence and human testimony was critical. It allowed for a reconstruction that was not only factual, but also emotionally resonant, capturing the horror of the crime in a way that pure data alone could not. Perhaps most chillingly, the forensic findings confirmed what few wanted to accept. The violence was intimate. The wounds were inflicted at close range, often with multiple strikes, suggesting moments of confrontation, emotional escalation, and direct interaction. The crime was not a detached act. It was personal, relational, and deeply disturbing in its intensity. The evidence revealed the physical manifestation of betrayal, the translation of emotional turbulence into tangible, lethal action within the sanctuary of a home. The forensic narrative also raised questions about timing and sequence. Did one attack precede the other? Were the victims confronted simultaneously? Investigators used a combination of blood patterns, positioning, and trace evidence to approximate the order of events. The reconstruction suggested a rapid, escalating series of actions, punctuated by resistance, defensive measures, and ultimately, fatal outcomes. Every detail reinforced the notion that the estate, once a place of comfort and safety, had become a theater of violence, orchestrated in ways that were both chaotic and deliberate. And as the forensic narrative solidified, the focus inevitably returned to the suspect. The alignment of evidence, DNA, fingerprints, access patterns, behavioral cues, pointed toward Nick Reiner. The scientific findings provided the structural backbone for a case that had already captured public attention, translating horror into investigable facts. They offered not just confirmation, but clarity, allowing investigators to move from speculation to prosecution with a methodical, evidence-based foundation. Yet the revelations were far from over. Each new finding raised additional questions about motive, emotional context, and the hidden dynamics within the Reiner family. How had tensions escalated to this point? What unseen pressures or psychological triggers had contributed? And what would emerge from the deeper investigation into the family's history, interactions, and private life? The forensic evidence answered some questions while amplifying others, creating a complex narrative that combined horror, psychology, and intimate betrayal. The autopsy and forensic revelations transformed the tragedy from mere rumor into documented reality. They provided a map of violence, a timeline of events, and a window into the relational and psychological forces at play. But while the physical evidence told one part of the story, the human dimension, the motivations, emotions, and hidden histories, remained to be explored. And what investigators, analysts, and the public would soon uncover about the Reiner family's inner life would challenge everything we thought we knew about the victims, the perpetrator, and the dynamics that led to one of Hollywood's most shocking tragedies. But even with all the forensic evidence, one question lingered above all. Why would this happen in a family that appeared, from the outside, to be so ordinary, so successful, and so loved? The answers would emerge slowly, piece by piece, as the investigation intersected with revelations from friends, family, and even Hollywood insiders. The entertainment world is no stranger to commentary, speculation, and criticism. Actors, directors, and industry veterans often weigh in on public events, scandals, and tragedies. But when Morgan Freeman, a man whose voice has narrated some of the most iconic stories in cinematic history, speaks, the world listens. And when he broke his long silence regarding Rob Reiner, after Reiner's shocking death, the reaction was immediate, electric, and divisive. His words were not gentle, not diplomatic, not careful. They were stark. He was depraved. 3 words. That was all it took to send ripples across Hollywood and the world beyond. But their impact was immense. In the context of a man who had been admired, celebrated, and revered for decades, Freeman's statement was both jarring and revelatory. It contradicted the public perception of Rob Reiner as a genial, witty, and beloved figure. It invited questions, speculation, and scrutiny on a scale few statements ever achieve. Everyone wanted to know, why now? What had Freeman witnessed, known, or experienced that led him to describe Reiner in such a damning way? To understand the gravity of Freeman's words, one must first understand the relationship between the two men. Rob Reiner, throughout his career, had collaborated with some of the greatest talents of the era, and Freeman was no exception. Both shared years of interactions within Hollywood's complex ecosystem, on sets, at events, and behind the scenes. Freeman's reputation as thoughtful, measured, and deliberate in public statements only amplified the weight of his words. He rarely spoke lightly, rarely offered commentary that could not be corroborated, and almost never used a platform to condemn outright. For him to call someone depraved is not just commentary, it is a moral judgment, a condemnation that carries both professional and personal weight. The timing of the statement was also significant. Rob Reiner was dead. He could not respond, explain, or defend himself. Freeman's choice to speak after the fact meant that his words would carry uncontested influence. They would shape public perception, dominate headlines, and become inseparable from the narrative of the tragedy. It also raised the stakes of interpretation. Was Freeman referencing behavior within the family, conduct on professional sets, personal morality, or a combination of all 3? The ambiguity was deliberate, in some ways, forcing the audience and media to grapple with nuance, speculation, and their own assumptions. Hollywood insiders reacted with a mix of shock and curiosity. Colleagues who had worked closely with Reiner questioned the validity, context, and implications of Freeman's statement. Was it hyperbole? Was it literal? Did it refer to personal conduct, professional behavior, or something entirely hidden from public view? Freeman himself offered little elaboration, leaving the world to read between the lines and fill in gaps with conjecture. This ambiguity, intentional or not, ensured sustained attention, debate, and intrigue. Psychologists and cultural commentators quickly weighed in. They suggested that Freeman's statement reflected not just observation, but ethical judgment. To label someone depraved implies sustained behavior, moral failing, or a pattern of actions contrary to societal norms. It is not a term reserved for momentary lapses. It conveys a deeply held assessment of character. The fact that such a statement came from Freeman, a figure widely respected for wisdom, patience, and judgment, added a level of credibility that few could ignore. The public reaction was immediate. Social media platforms exploded with discussion, disbelief, and analysis. Fans of both Reiner and Freeman struggled to reconcile the statements with their mental images of the men. Headlines splashed across news outlets, framing Freeman's words as both a revelation and a provocation. Talk shows debated, forums speculated, and articles dissected every possible interpretation. Freeman's statement had not only added a new dimension to the tragedy, it had shifted the narrative, redirecting public attention from solely the crime to questions about character, morality, and hidden truths. The statement also intersected with the unfolding investigation in unexpected ways. If Freeman's assessment was accurate, it suggested that there were underlying dynamics within the Reiner family that may have contributed to the tragedy. It hinted at emotional, psychological, or relational issues that were invisible to outsiders, yet profound in their impact. It also created a new layer of complexity for investigators. A narrative that combined forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and now high-profile commentary, all pointing toward a story far more intricate than a simple act of violence. But Freeman's words did more than shock. They invited a deeper reflection on perception versus reality. How much do we truly know about those we admire? Can public personas conceal moral failings, relational dysfunction, or personal darkness? And how do we reconcile the work someone has created? The laughter, insight, and cultural impact, with revelations that suggest profound ethical shortcomings? These questions struck at the heart of the public's fascination with celebrity, morality, and human complexity. Inside Hollywood, the statement also sparked introspection. Actors, directors, and colleagues considered their own relationships with Reiner, their experiences on sets, and their understanding of his personal and professional demeanor. Anecdotes surfaced, some confirming, others contradicting Freeman's words, each contributing to a mosaic of interpretation that was messy, emotional, and intensely human. The complexity of human relationships, particularly under the pressures of fame, wealth, and scrutiny, became impossible to ignore. Legal analysts noted that Freeman's statement, though morally significant, would have no direct bearing on the criminal case. It was not admissible evidence, nor a factor in proving guilt or innocence. Yet its cultural and psychological weight was undeniable. In shaping public perception, in influencing narratives, and in framing discourse, Freeman's words became a critical element of the story, independent of the courtroom or investigation. They colored every conversation, every media report, and every social media debate that followed. Even within the family, the statement introduced tension, reflection, and complexity. Romy, Nick, and other relatives were forced to confront not just grief, but public evaluation of their family's internal dynamics. Freeman's assessment was both liberating and damning. It validated suspicions for some, shocked others, and demanded that every nuance of the family's private life be reconsidered in light of tragedy, behavior, and motive. The statement also carried lasting implications for Reiner's legacy. How do we remember a man whose work inspired millions, but whose private conduct was questioned by one of the most trusted voices in Hollywood? Can brilliance coexist with moral failing? Freeman's words forced a reckoning not just with the facts of the crime, but with the broader questions of human character.